It is no secret that EA recently made an ass of themselves in their attempt to rebrand loot boxes as surprise mechanics. They desperately tried to make the case that loot boxes are basically like Kinder eggs, that it's all quite fun and quite ethical. Yeah, it didn't take long before EA got called out on their BS. Now, since then, the UK Parliament has met up once again to discuss the aftermath of that embarrassing hearing, as well as ways to move forward. Recently, there was some back and forth between the committee and a member of parliament going by the name Margaret James, the UK Minister for Digital and the Creative Industries. Much of this discussion was transcribed by news outlet gamesindustry.biz, so I'll be using their article as the basis of this video. So, with that out of the way, let's break it down, shall we? One of the committee members asked Margaret for her thoughts on loot boxes and their potential link to gambling, as well as steps that countries like Belgium and Netherlands have taken to regulate them. Now, this committee member actually went as far as saying, or as EA rather bizarrely called them, surprise mechanics, basically expressing incredulity with EA's laughable attempt to pretend loot boxes aren't what they actually are. In response, Margaret James pointed out that Belgium and Netherlands laws are different, noting how they have taken offline gambling laws to online games, and how the UK's gambling laws don't quite work that way. She then proceeded to contest the notion that loot boxes are gambling, because in the UK, gambling is defined as true games of chance where money is at stake. She claimed that loot boxes cannot be cashed out and that they only reward digital items like cosmetics and gameplay enhancements rather than financial rewards. Yeah, I wholeheartedly disagree with this part of her argument. For one, plenty of games do allow you to cash out, like PUBG and CSGO, among many others. FIFA also allows players to cash out, even if through unsanctioned means. Third-party gambling websites where you can earn real money are being created using loot boxes featured in these games as a foundation. And even for games that cannot be cashed out, sure, they don't offer financial reward, but James is vastly underestimating how much value people can place in video game worlds, especially in online games where there is some kind of social hierarchy. In these games, people want to look badass, they want to be the strongest, there is genuine emotional and psychological attachment, to the point where these online worlds might become more important than money and basic necessities. Money for a lot of these people can become a means to further their in-game goals when these in-game goals become more of a priority than sustaining their livelihood. Her argument is that legally in the UK, gambling is defined by games of chance that offer financial reward. But by definition, gambling is also a risky action one takes in the hopes of a desired reward. And among certain crowds of susceptible people, in-game items are highly desired. As long as that's the case, monetary reward or not, loot boxes are gambling, or certainly come close enough to it that it is worth scrutinizing in a similar manner. From a psychological standpoint, loot boxes very much work exactly like slot machines. Loot boxes take visual and audio cues from slot machines for a reason, and most importantly, both loot boxes and slot machines involve users being manipulated into spending money because their addiction will often take over reason or financial responsibility. Now, when asked whether James was unconcerned about loot boxes, she did respond with, quote, "I didn't say that." She then elaborated that she believes if tangible evidence emerges, especially where youth is involved, she'd take this issue very seriously, but doesn't believe that there is enough research done yet, and that regulation should only be pursued once more definitive evidence is presented and provided. She said that at best, there is currently some studies claiming correlation between loot boxes and more traditional gambling, but not direct causation, which I can't agree with, though I would say that loot boxes are its own form or brand of gambling, that it still warrants scrutiny, that it's too unchecked right now, given how much trouble they can cause, given how exploitable they are. Maybe it's not gambling in the way UK defines it, but it is a troublesome and psychologically manipulative in-game mechanic that encourages compulsive spending nonetheless, with the primary purpose being to extract as much money from users as possible, without limits. Now, James did emphasize that she's not being complacent to loot boxes when the committee asked her if she was just waiting around for something to happen before taking action. They are looking into these types of mechanics alongside the UK's Gambling Commission, but she believes we need a better understanding and more study on the topic before just shooting for regulations. She said she believes in the importance of searching for evidence to not just look at symptoms, but also underlying problems we may be missing. The topic then shifted to gaming addiction and the World Health Organization's classification of gaming disorder. On that front, James claimed that specialists she's spoken to have claimed only 1% of gamers have problems with spending too much time playing. Now, this right here is a bad way to frame it, as it is believed that there are about 2 billion gamers in the world right now, and 1% of that is still a whopping 20 million people. Companies may say the same thing about people addicted to loot boxes, that only a small percentage of gamers uncontrollably spend money on them, but a small percentage of a huge population is still a lot of people who might need help. James did add that she isn't denying that there are people with problems, that evidence is being actively searched for because there is very little research that's been done when it comes to gaming habits. She did agree, however, that game companies should take the World Health Organization's classification seriously and introduce solutions like, say, adding in-game alerts when people have been playing for too long, which some companies have actually done. Nintendo in particular, a few of their titles do warn players about excessive playtime. Then, after a committee member suggested adding time limits to games, James said she believes the World Health Organization's classification of gaming disorder also comes from little research, and that what people consider addictive gaming behavior might depend on numerous factors and circumstances. For example, in cultures that emphasize academic success, where ironically studying in itself becomes its own compulsive behavior and addiction, gaming for more than a few hours might be seen as addictive. In other countries where academic success isn't as huge of an emphasis, gaming for a few hours might be seen as pretty normal behavior. James also relayed how there are reports from families who see gaming as a relief, with some families actually glad to see children playing some video games rather than studying all the time. She also noted that a lot of the research currently done on gaming addiction comes from Southeast Asia, which is not a big enough sample size for the entire world. From there, on this topic, James finally concluded by saying that there's just not enough research on these matters yet, and that more research should be pursued. This is why, according to her, the UK's National Health Service has been given $2 billion in funding just for this purpose specifically. The hope is that this will allow the organization to research links between mental health and gaming and its monetization practices. The conversation then shifted back to loot boxes and the notion that they're very much akin to gambling. The argument was brought up by the committee that even if rewards earned from loot boxes aren't monetary in nature, they can still evoke that sense of gambling for young minds, a point that I 100% agree with. James retorted that she takes issue with that stance because games aren't purely a game of chance, as there is some skill involved in winning or achieving certain goals. In retort to that, I will argue that oftentimes, games will be designed to make the experience of people who don't pay up much more insufferable, leaving them no choice but to partake in a paid game of chance. Plenty of games technically allow you to earn everything via gameplay, but it would take so much grind and so many hours to do so due to artificially imposed roadblocks and obstacles that it's much easier to simply pay some money. That's how these games are designed. And with loot boxes specifically, odds are tweaked in such a way that a significant amount of money has to be shelled out before a player has a good chance of obtaining a desired rare item. Yes, video games aren't purely a game of chance like slot machines are, but the game of chance within the game is often made to be an integral part of the overall game design. Games will often be designed to nudge players towards these monetization schemes, randomized or not, by making gameplay without them unbearable and untenable. Elder Scrolls Blades is a perfect example. Those timers on chests that keep piling up, yeah, that was intentionally implemented to hamper progression so that players have to buy gems to unlock these chests instantly, or so players have to just outright buy loot boxes from the store. These companies understand that people instinctually have a need for instant gratification. And there is no skill involved here when it comes to waiting for timers to die down. You either wait or you pay up so that you can remove that artificial timer. Same thing for a game like Dungeon Keeper, where you have to wait a long time for progression to be made, or you could just buy the in-game currency that will completely mitigate that. That's how these games are designed. That's how egregious they are. The committee also brought up FIFA Ultimate and how loot boxes there affect your in-game performance rather than being just cosmetics. James did concede on that front that there is a distinction and that certain types of loot boxes can definitely be more dangerous when it comes to their potential correlation with gambling. Now, I still don't think James understands how much value certain gamers place on cosmetics. Unlike slot machines, video games are unique in that there is an in-game avatar who represents the player, so how that in-game persona comes across, how it looks, is a huge part of the gameplay experience, especially in online games. It's a part of the game's enjoyment and the sense of empowerment. Just saying, if these cosmetics were truly so worthless, we wouldn't be seeing cosmetic items in games like Counter-Strike Go being listed at such high prices in the Steam marketplace. It's not that I don't agree that pay-to-win is worse than cosmetic microtransactions. I'm just saying that cosmetics shouldn't be dismissed as irrelevant either. This whole notion of they're just cosmetics is complete bullshit. James then moved on to talk about how her biggest concern is young people spending excessively and how she accepts that for young folks with propensity to gamble, those habits could be brought out by loot boxes that could lead to further problems. The discussion then shifted to Epic Games and the impression they made during the previous UK Parliament hearing alongside EA that they have a disregard for how Fortnite might impact players from a mental and livelihood standpoint as long as the game is successful. James responded that this kind of attitude is not acceptable, that a game company can't just create a game and then wash their hands of potential consequences and responsibilities regardless of whether there's regulation in place or not, that they have a due diligence to collect certain data and use that to inform how they can create their games in the most responsible and healthy manner possible, adding that maybe game companies should share this data to inform others. Now, by data, I'm assuming James is referring to information like average playtime or average money spent, statistics like that rather than personal information, as the exchange of personal information would be unacceptable amongst the general public and would violate all kinds of laws. But in terms of how much people play and spend on average, data like that, sharing that could indeed provide some useful insight. But I get the sense that game companies aren't too keen on revealing that information, given that it might reveal some skeletons that they don't want the public to see in their closet. James then pointed out that not all companies have this kind of negligent attitude, though some definitely do. James then added that she doesn't believe only the games industry should be doing research on the potentially harmful effects of certain video games, that government bodies should independently conduct their own as well, calling for public funding on this front, especially given she's been told by a colleague that gaming is several years behind gambling when it comes to protecting the vulnerable, about which she said, quote, "If that is true, that is lamentable and the industry has a job to do." The final topic of discourse was the freemium model that mobile titles often employ. James said that while the model does give rise to companies with aggressive commercial objectives, she also said that this isn't always the case. And yeah, that's true. Not all monetized free-to-play titles are super egregious. There are free-to-play games that get it right. As she pointed out, quote, "With a more mature company, they should be seeing the benefits of demonstrating a care for their user base in the way you've outlined." Yes, some companies are pretty good about it, but it would be naive to say that the majority of major free-to-play games don't employ aggressive, harmful monetization schemes. Most companies get into the freemium model because they want to monetize, plain and simple, not because they're looking to be mature and make the best game possible. In my opinion, saying that, well, not everyone does it isn't a good excuse for not keeping something in check, because when it comes to egregious monetization, more than enough companies do it to warrant scrutiny, to warrant regulation, to warrant checks and balances. This gathering finally concluded with James sharing final thoughts that read as follows. "It's like any industry. There are some companies who have this short-term view that the more time you spend on my product, the more money I make. That is not true of all companies in the sector or indeed of any other sector. factor. There are companies who have a longer-term, more responsible attitude to their customer base compared with other companies who have a short-term and more aggressive commercial view of their user base, and the latter need to be brought into line. So overall, I think that James brought up a few good points, but there's also a lot about her take that I disagree with. I get the sense that she's definitely not a gamer, and that she doesn't quite understand why these games and their monetization tactics, microtransactions or loot boxes, cosmetic or pay-to-win, can be so addictive to certain types of gamers. I will say this, though, she didn't come off as clueless as EA's VP of Legal and Government Affairs when she talked about surprise mechanics and all this bullshit during that hearing. James wasn't trying to rebrand loot boxes. She wasn't claiming loot boxes are completely innocent or ethical. She was arguing against the notion that loot boxes are gambling the way UK defines it. She was making the case that there are different cases for these kinds of mechanics, some worse than others, and that more research needs to be done before regulation can be enacted and fully pursued. From what I'm reading here, she's asking for further due diligence before taking tangible measures, which, okay, sure. And she does conclude at the end that for certain companies who are clearly being predatory in their business models, they need to be, quote, brought into line. At the same time, though, I do think she's underestimating how serious of an issue loot boxes can be for a significant number of people. If the government wants to hear from people who actually play and understand games in terms of why they believe loot boxes are so harmful, I would highly recommend they watch Jim Sterling's July 1st Jimquisition episode titled The Addictive Cost of Predatory Video Game Monetization. There, Jim not only highlights plenty of articles detailing cases of players' excessive spending on games featuring monetization tactics such as FIFA, Fortnite, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, so on and so forth. He also highlights a presentation by Tribeflame CEO Torolf Jernstrom, in which he literally breaks down how loot boxes are tweaked to maximize psychological manipulation of the masses.
A summary of a huge bunch of behavioral psychology. So the tricks on how to monetize a game well. Some of you will probably be slightly shocked by all the tricks I have listed here, but I'll leave the morality of it out of the talk. We can discuss it if we have time later.
On top of that, Jim compiled various testimonials from people with addictive tendencies who decided to seek respite from gambling through video games only to find themselves right back into that void. Testimonials ranged from people who got addicted to Overwatch's cosmetic loot boxes to those who got addicted to Call of Duty or FIFA's pay-to-win or pay-to-gain advantage microtransactions and loot boxes. One testimonial in particular highlighted how he tried to get away from gambling by finding a healthy alternative and replacement, but he found that almost every game he booted up seemed to prey on his addictive tendencies through monetization that encourages excessive compulsive spending. So I'd like to read you this testimonial actually, which touches upon so many good points on why video game monetization is so scummy. It reads, quote, "I spent a good portion of my life constantly high and wasting all of my money on drugs. I met my partner, now fiancé, in World of Warcraft, and with her help, I finally managed to get sober. One big part of going through rehab and trying to control my addictive behaviors, one of the things I learned was to try and find a healthy replacement for the substance. Obviously, being the chronically ill hermit and geek that I am, I turned my focus back to my childhood love of video games. This, ironically, was around the time of the beta of Overwatch, and me and my World of Warcraft guildies loved it. It was so much fun. I love the idea of collecting cosmetics for my favorite characters as I am a big collector, and naturally fell into the trap of loot boxes. I kept getting sucked in with the spend more to get more trap that a lot of publishers use to get people spending. I lost track of the amount of money I spent, but thanks to rehab, I could quickly identify that this was dangerous behavior and I quit playing the game. I spent the next few years jumping from game to game, leaving when the microtransactions got too much to bear. Rift was a nice distraction from World of Warcraft, and I had played it from beta, and then it went free to play with loot boxes as well as a cash shop. Guild Wars 2, cash shop and loot boxes. Deus Ex, a series I treasure, microtransactions. Assassin's Creed Origins, same thing. The place where I once found distraction and salvation is now preying upon my addictive nature and impulse spending problems. It hurts, it really does. I have to turn away from $100 Australian games because they've implemented implemented microtransactions, and the idea of popping in a few bucks to make life easier is so tempting, and I keep falling for it. My fiance has now taken away both my debit card and my PayPal details to try and curb this. It's this weird mentality of it's only here for a limited time, and if I don't get it now, I may never get it again and not complete my collection. Hitting that buy now button, seeing the rewards pop up, the spinning of the dice or slot wheels ticking past the rare loot, the just one more rationale, it completely overrules any common sense like you need this money to pay the rent or your medical bills or food. That's the thing a lot of people don't understand about compulsive or addictive behavior. People can't just stop because that addiction is something that's deeply ingrained within their psyche and the chemistry of their brain. It's a mental health issue that you can't just turn off like a switch. Game companies know this, and these are the kinds of people, the ones who can't turn off that switch, who they seek to exploit. Most money from microtransactions aren't made from your average gamer, but rather so-called whales who spend hundreds, thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands on in-game items or rolling the dice. To further highlight this point, Jim Sterling pointed to a study showing that the only ones who spend less money on loot boxes after they've been removed from a game are problem gamblers and the so-called whales, which goes to show exactly who loot boxes are targeted for. And you have to understand that whales aren't just rich people with money to burn. Many of them are also people who just cannot afford to spend that kind of money on in-game items, but cannot help themselves because of the way these games are designed and because of the way their brains are wired. They'll prioritize the satisfaction of getting a rare in-game item over basic necessities like food and money. So yeah, if anyone needs a full understanding of why loot boxes are god-awful, why these kinds of systems need checks and balances, watch this Jimquisition episode. It's one of the most well-rounded summaries of the issue at hand. So with all said and done, it was interesting to see the kind of back and forth that the UK is having in regards to loot boxes here. It is good to see that the conversation is happening, that there are multiple sides being presented, that the issue is being looked into rather than outright dismissed like these other games companies are doing, that loot boxes' ability to be exploited is being acknowledged to an extent at least, even if the law and studies and research haven't fully caught up yet. Yes, I know people are apprehensive about government intervention. I get that it's not ideal, but the gaming industry asked for this, they brought this on themselves, and if they don't want to regulate themselves, and they've shown they don't want to, well, then they should get ready to face the consequences. So there you have it, folks. These are one man's thoughts and opinions on the latest UK Parliament meeting in regards to loot boxes. I'd love to hear what your take is on what James had to say in the comments below. With that, I would like to end this news update and discussion video. Thank you for tuning in. To be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.